Our next pair of speakers, there are a pair of speakers today, are Bhaskar, Sarkar, and Bishnupryia Ghosh, who are both professors at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Bishnupryia Ghosh's primary appointment is in English literature, but there's a cross appointment in film and media, and Bhaskar is a professor in film and media. Bishnupryia Ghosh has published widely, among other things, 2 books on South Asian literature, with a particular focus on India. And Bhaskar Sarkar has published a book which is directly relevant to our work here, entitled Mourning the Nation, Indian Cinema, which is a book about Indian cinema and the trauma of partition, a very crucial and influential study of Indian cinema and the politics of conflict. And we invited them here together because a lot of the work that they do, they actually do together. They have done work on the notion of the global popular. Bishnupryia Ghosh, in that framework, has coined the term global icon, which is an important concept for understanding cultural flows in contemporary media culture. And most importantly, perhaps for this panel and for this project, they are the editors of the Routledge Companion to Media and Risk, which came out, I think, 2 years ago, 2020. Today, they're going to talk about fintech, pandemic palliatives, and the Indian state's trust quotient. Thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Vinzenz, for that very thorough introduction. The title of our thing, I won't repeat it, it's there. So about method first. We don't do social science, so it'll be intensely situated. At the same time, it'll be speculative, partly. So, within the larger discourses of normative ordering, and we thought we'd start with that since we're in this building, Ulrich Beck occupies a central place. In particular, his take on a reflexive modernity where awareness or sense of risk is inversely proportional to trust in bureaucrats and technocrats. This suspicion of experts and even the state increases as risk ontologies escalate, moving towards the uncertain. And I could give you a great anecdote from my ex-student Rahul Mukherjee now, whose book Radiant Infrastructures is a big deal. He talks about radiant infrastructures being the nuclear power plants and the cell phone towers, which also are supposed to produce these radiation hazards. And this part of a western town in Gujarat, where people had left a neighborhood because they were worried about the radiation risks posed by all these cell phone towers. And then a court order had the cell phone towers removed. But this middle-aged guy would not come back, even when the experts were telling him that the radiation hazards has really declined over the years, until the peacocks returned. And I found this to be a very poetic, but absolutely crucial evidence of the way in which people think about expertise, and the question of trust gets worked out among ordinary people. Well before Beck's famous formulation, and this has just been covered, writing after World War I, economist Frank Knight made a sharp distinction between risk and uncertainty. He recognized radical forms of uncertainty that cannot be reduced to calculable risk. This Knightian insight was sidelined in order to produce a century of triumphant risk management models and practices. But of course, in 2008 and 2009, the financial crisis, then Fukushima in 2011, and in 2021, the pandemic, not to mention the ongoing disasters associated with climate change and mass-scale destruction and displacement, have brought back radical uncertainty to our consciousness. Precarity is now, as we all know, an intrinsic part of contemporary life.
So the collection that Vinzenz, was talking about was a decade and a half in the making. And we had started with the claim that risk is only legible by its mediation, that in many ways there's a lot of work on risk communication, but what do risk media actually do to make risk apprehensible? But in conditions of intensifying precarity, when conflicts increase and accumulate between stakeholders, it is also clear, and this is something we didn't get to so much in that book, it's clear that risk mediation produces new risk ontologies that exacerbate the situation. So today we're going to do we're going to talk about the mediatization of all walks of life, to think about how that produces risk. We pursue this point to think with the ConTrust inquiry into new qualities of uncertainty and insecurity and their implication for trust. And the scene of our analysis, as you will see, is India under the authoritarian rule of Narendra Modi, and he's been in power since 2014. So Bhaskar will do the first part, and then I'll move on.
There exists. I begin with the statement of neoclassical and classical economics. There exists a market, a speculative statement at best, which economic theory transformed into something like an inevitability, an edict worthy of a new religion, via the liberal use of mathematical logic and modeling. There exists. This search for markets, which has to do with the identification of opportunities, that is, as yet unsatisfied demands, and the possibility of turning some profits in the act of meeting these demands, reach its apogee in the financial sector. Financial instruments, such as options on future income streams, intended to mitigate the risks associated with, say, agrarian production, vulnerable to the dangers of floods and locusts, soon led to secondary markets for options on options to provide some protection to the primary risk insurers to distribute the incidence of risk, but also, crucially, to make some more money. That there exists a market game of seizing every opportunity for making money led to tertiary and quaternary markets and beyond. Over time, it brought us the enigmatic and runaway instruments we now know as derivatives. And we all know this, right? But I thought it would be important to kind of bring this up again at a little bit of length, because that's what I'm going with here. In spite of the global financial meltdown of 2008 and 9, in spite of the hard lessons it begged us to pay heed to, the International Monetary Fund, the overwhelmingly premier institution of global financial governance, has been pushing developing economies such as Brazil, India, Indonesia, Russia, to undertake a series of structural transformations, deploying digital technologies that have come to be known as fintech. The idea is to apply fintech not only for financial services and activities, but also to other domains of life. Invoking the notion of stacking data in information technology, the approach calls for layering various levels. Check out this diagram in which iSprit, the agency that is creating the digital infrastructure in India, summarizes the stack imagination, and that is often reproduced in discussions of the developments from the presence-less layer, the bottom layer, where the universal kind of ID assigned, 12-digit ID number assigned to every Indian. And at this point, I think 1.2 billion Indians have this ID. It's a remarkable achievement in some respect, right, in a country like India. But what that does, this form of Aadhar or authentication, Aadhar, by the way, means foundation. It could mean the body, it could mean shape. So it's sort of foundational here. Aadhar authentication allows for presence-less transactions. You don't have to be present bodily. The next layer is, of course, paperless, where you have like eKYC. KYC stands for Know Your Customer, which is a real pain because every November, your bank will send you a thing saying like, you know, come and show yourself so that we know you're still alive and you're the real person. And we, of course, live in the US and can't go in November, so it's always a problem for us. The next layer is cashless, and finally, it's a consent layer, which is about really amassing this huge amount of personal data and turning into an open store. for companies, the government, but of course also companies. So this is interesting because whereas, in the West, much of the focus has been on how Facebook or Twitter or whatever, Google, amasses data and sells it to other companies, third parties. Here it's the government that's doing it. I'll come back to this particular diagram soon. My argument here today is that these transformations that are required for this to happen involve nothing short of, one, reworking the state itself into a service platform consisting of private public generated apps. An example I could quickly give you is that I was going back to India last summer and then winter, and they have this thing called the Aragya Setu. There's so many apps to do with COVID that I get confused. But one of them is Air Suvidha. Suvidha means convenience. So when you enter India, you have to fill out a declaration form online. So I fill out my name, I fill out my where I am coming from, and the next thing it says download the app. And I click on it and it starts downloading some completely different app. So that particular platform is actually a domain where parts are sold out to various kinds of people. So it's really, really this kind of commercialization is frightening also, but also really irritating. And probably the irritating part is less important here. So it involves the reworking of the state into a service platform consisting of private public apps, and two, the mediation of life itself in terms of financial logics. And this is where I will remind you of what I was talking about, right? The kind of looking for opportunities to make a little bit more money, to monetize every aspect of everything. The question that bothers me most about all this, if Feng Che spoke of the attrition of national sovereignty with globalization, this was a very famous 1999 article, I think. In his felicitous words, the nation form is being gradually spectralized by global capital. Then what does this latest remediation of the state do to the social contract, to social security, to state services? What happens when education or public health, which I think all of you understand as essentially public goods with positive externalities, these get reworked in terms of the drive to monetize and turn into profit until that last vestige of opportunity for a narrow form of potentiation and extraction has been utterly exhausted. According to the IMF, benefits from using the financial sector technologies, modalities, and processes across all sectors would include the promotion of, let's see, what's the next one? So this is just a timeline. I keep changing from time to time. Just read it when you can. Promotion of the financial participation of citizens, suggesting a democratization of the financial sector. So this is how this kind of populist idea of, oh, but this will enable everyone to participate in the new kind of online bazaar, that is very appealing to a lot of people. Two, increased expeditiousness and efficiency of near instantaneous financial transactions in an increasingly cashless economy. Three, the innovative linking of state services to financial services, centered on the unique and stable digital identity number for each citizen subject. Now, for a sloth-like post-colonial state, such as India, where official functioning and state services have been mired in bureaucratic logjam for over 7 decades, promises of mobility and speed, coverage and streamlining, efficiency and innovation might seem too good to pass up. This has been overlaid with nationalist entrepreneurial ideologies and interests, at least 2 of which deserve mention. During the previous Congress Party rule from 2003 to 2013, when the country emerged as an IT powerhouse, Nandan Nilekani, a tech innovator entrepreneur not that unlike Bill Gates, with a rather circumscribed, meaning limited, interest in the public good, proposed a unique identity for each Indian as a first step towards bringing governance into the 21st century, harnessing the new capacities of IT. So this was the Aadhar Card. right? And so if this is 2009 when the Aadhar card was, first Aadhar cards were issued. And then by 2015, you have this DigiLocker where you can safeguard your NFTs and stuff like that. Now, how many Indians who are not even literate can really access these? That's an open question. Second, with the new regime, which came to power because of a massive political mobilization based on Hindutva or an essential and immutable Hinduness, the techno-nationalism took on a populist, nativist veneer. So typically the argument went like this: the Facebook people, the Google people, and the Amazon people who have already captured their share of the Indian market, how do the rest of us enter online enterprise, service, and fun? How do we be entrepreneurial there, right? So the idea is to do this at the domestic level by domestic companies. One thing I want you to note is how, from 2000 until 2012, every year there's one watershed moment. And then 2015, suddenly, boom, twice, two things. 2016 also, and then 2018, and then 2019, 2020. So there's a kind of acceleration that's happening with the new government in this kind of transformation. The Modi regime comes to power in 2014, right? The previous government, the Manmohan Singh government, he was a prime minister, with Singh, an economist trained at the MIT at the helm. He was often criticized by the IMF and the foreign trade journals for, economics is a perfect example, for being too slow in implementing change. It's noteworthy that India fared far better than most Asian and developing countries during the 2008 to 11 period. The BJP and Modi won the elections on the promise of unleashing the full potential of the country, the slumdog aspirations of its young population. But there is something else at stake here for this increasingly autocratic regime: the centralization of national data that can be sold to capitalists, even as the state keeps saying no data on questions about its own performance or the COVID deaths in the country's interiors. So the Indian Statistical Bureau doesn't, as far as I remember, no, it didn't have a head for the last couple of years. So of course, no data. Meanwhile, all this data is being amassed and sold to private companies. And a second reason being political surveillance. So India Stack, this is the IMF pushed program. And this is India's great sort of achievement, according to the Modi government. In embracing this, India has shown leadership. This is the first country that has adopted this with such gung-ho speed. And of course, it gets high marks from the IMF, delivering the country's 1.4 billion citizen consumers to global capital. In keeping with the Scramble for India, and this is of course a play on the 1885 Berlin conference, where Africa was divided up between the European powers, except in this case, the powers are all Indian mainly. The Adanis, the Ambanis, the Tatas, and a handful of other families within the country. This government is slowly bartering away the country to these various interest groups. In spite of the relentless rhetoric of connecting various sectors and new possibilities generated, synergies generated, interestingly, look at the this is the logo of India Stack. There is nothing that suggests connection or interconnection or synergy, because it's just stacking, right? The green and the orange, those bars there. And here too, there are these layers, but it's not clear that there is interconnections and crossing over from one to the other. I guess one might think of something like concentric circles or nested circles, so that at the core is the presence-less layer, the ID card, and then the paperless layer and the cashless layer. Other way to think about it would be the ID card, and then you have the immediate stuff with the bank, then the credit cards, then the phone, then and every time I go, I'm harassed to like connect my phone service to, and since I don't, because I don't have an ID card, I refuse to get an ID card in India. My phone keeps getting cancelled, the whole service line, and I have to keep renewing it. So the ideology of synergistic connections seems to have come largely from the IMF, the political leaders, as well as popular discourse. This is this particular representation and also the logo come from iSpirit, the actual like agency that's developing has developed the infrastructure. So they're less about the sort of rara thing about the synergies. So what does the stack refer to? And I kind of went through this, the slide with the 4 layers and the different layers of, paperless, first presence-less, then paperless, then cashless, and then finally the consent layer. But there are other things that one should look at. We talked about the eKYC, the digital locker, but then there's IMPS, the immediate payment service. And you go to India now, even for people who live there, sometimes they're overwhelming. There's so much abbreviated acronyms. The UPI, the Unified Payment Interface, which is only domestic, and there's like big debates about which is better. The AEPS, Aadhar Enabled Payment System, and then Paytm, FingPay, proliferation of these kind of apps. FingPay, of course, is the finger. So this is good for the illiterate. What does it mean to have apps that promise expeditious delivery of services whenever and wherever needed, when the focus is on the apps themselves and not on the production or service that must secure supply when needed? The early vaccine debacle, the oxygen cylinder shortage, the hype got the better of reality. It threatened to evacuate reality until the really real kind of bit back in this horrible way, returned with a vengeance. Bishnu will pick up here, but I want to make one final point. Modi has been a charismatic leader, but his charisma has been based also on projections. And these projections have been often quite duplicitous, deceitful image operations. So I don't want to say everything about him and his persona is falsehood, but one can talk about the election campaign video way back from 2014, and you cannot find a trace of it anywhere on the web. It's been scrubbed away from everywhere, where his team used images from Germany and Japan to show how great Gujarat is doing. Then stuff like use of hologram images of Modi at various election campaigns so that he could address multiple election campaigns in multiple locations at the same time. The story of the rags to riches chaiwala, the tea seller boy, who then moves up to the highest echelons of power in India. All these are questioned elements of it. I'm not saying that the whole story is wrong. And in the middle of the pandemic, what does it do? For a period of 3 months, he almost makes no appearance except for his monthly radio program, Man Ki Baat. And then these are very curated, very carefully orchestrated images of the politician as saint. His only public darshan during this incredibly crucial period was of a few carefully staged videos and still photographs citing recognizable tropes associated with vernacular modern calendar art or bazaar art aesthetic. These representations place the leader in lush garden settings with birds, animals, and trees, as if the natural calamity warrants a surrender to nature, perhaps in the hope of resuscitating a more benevolent and life-sustaining avatar of it. Modi's long white beard, draping shawl, composed demeanor channels not Bhima, the muscular prince warrior of the epic Mahabharata with a massive torso. Modi is famous for his 56-inch chest. But Bhishma, the wiser elder statesman of the clan who has risen above earthly desires and conflict. Sure, this assuages uncertainty to some extent, but with what effect? When the infection rates dipped in late 2020, Modi started gloating about his government's success instead of using the reprieve to build up medical infrastructures. When the national vaccination program did finally get into top gear, people found their proof of vaccination card emblazoned with the Prime Minister's face, a photo. This readiness to mark any state achievement as his personal triumph and to downplay or deny all missteps makes Modi's leadership unsavory for those who do fact checks of partisan talking points. But the ubiquitous and relentless propaganda does its work. As the public health situation improves, a large proportion of Indian voters are ready to accept and move beyond the regime's pandemic era lapses. Modi's familiar visage becoming inseparable from the medical protection that the card promises or ensures. So Bishnu will take over.
So let me tell you what happens with the Aadhar card. So in many respects, the COVID-19 pandemic can be regarded as a true emergence, an unprecedented occurrence at different orders of association, the biological and ecological, the economic and the social, that defines linear causality, it exemplifies radical uncertainty, which Knight periodically naturalizes when speaking of volatile markets. But as many scholars note, naturalization only evacuates the man-made disaster that was COVID-19, a globally synchronous public health crisis that exacerbated existing health inequities. And we know this story: endemic diseases, access to long-term healthcare, food security, housing. And this sharpened the differential vulnerabilities and deepened precarities. And Modi Shah's India is, of course, a premier example. And I'll talk about two very short episodes of crises. The migrant long walk home that you see here. This is a genre of journalistic footage that there's a method to why this particular photograph, but I can't go into that right now. But that's one, March 2020, and the medical oxygen crisis of May to March 2021. Now, on March 24, 2020, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced a national lockdown for 21 days following a 14-hour curfew on March 22nd. It was a massive endeavor, locking down 1.4 billion, the largest in the world. All modes of transportation were suspended, all workplaces, including construction sites, closed, and those with homes hunkered down, but the daily wage laborers in major cities, as most of you know, found themselves without refuge. Journalistic coverage iteratively documented migrants making their ways back to their villages and towns, some evicted, others harassed for curfew violations. Special trains were announced as late as May 1st, 2020, 40 days after the lockdown. This proved difficult since the migrants had to apply for e-passes to board them. With India's varying literacies, this additional bureaucratic process that failed many, even after the lateness of the offer, meant that millions were already on their way home. This is the binding promise, power of promises, I think, that Jens was talking about. The promise of state dispensations via the Aadhar card that Bhaskar was talking about, which you use for everything from bank loans to gas cylinders, failed to materialize in this instance. Instead of the Aadhar card, your digital ID, new e-passes were based on work permits, which left unregistered migrants on their own. To give you a sense of the scale of the problem, only 18.8% of Delhi's construction workers had the requisite building and construction worker or BOCW identity cards. Further, even those who finally got e-passes found they were tailored to individuated provisions, a feature of the app environment. Everything else had to be paid for. When the workers turned up with relatives, they were unable to take their assigned spot on trains. So this is the effect of this mediatization of this digital citizenship. This is one genre of images of people carrying their family back home. As the tragedy unfolded, 198 migrants died in road accidents on their way home between May 25th and 31st. Others died of exhaustion and starvation. A part of the human interest stories circulated to humanize the problem in this sort of singular plural mechanism. But we also have a trickle of data, and I won't quote this, from grassroots organizations such as Jan Sahas or Gram Vani that had long-term ties with migrant labor communities. And this is all the data that we have. The electronically archived audio, visual, and print traces index not only the migrant choice of precarities, the existential uncertainty of infection or starvation as your two choices, but the deepening political distrust that accompanied the experience. A second crisis emerged around the shortage of medical oxygen in 2021, literally the failure to provide the breath infrastructure, not only for India's poor, but also for its middle class. And this time it escalated. In the hue and cry over oxygen, the government protested the demand was unreasonable. If India produced 3,842 metric tons a day, in April-May 2021, the need was for 11,000 MT per day. There were many compound logistics, such as insufficient cryogenic tankers, and there's a whole complication about how to deliver oxygen, inadequate filling stations for jumbo cylinders, as well as safe transport of oxygen to the hospitals. But at the heart of this failure, and this goes back to the financial part of the tech, was the increasing privatization of the health infrastructure. As early as September 2020, health experts had warned that the administration that India's medical oxygen via direct pipeline to hospitals was in short supply if COVID infections were to increase. They had marshaled a considerable amount of data to produce forecasts and predictions. Now, to be sure, to return to radical uncertainty, the Delta variant that had made SARS-CoV-2 entry into our lungs far easier than the previous variants was a black swan event that upped the ante. But since donations had poured into the PM Cares Fund, this is Modi's slush fund, after March 2020, so there's all Indians, but also the diaspora contributed to PM Cares. In October, the administration had floated tenders for the best bids to build 162 oxygen plants. 8 months later, the bidding wars had subsided, but none of these plants were operational, suggesting that the financial logic of profit had trumped the actual manufacture of the vital resource. By 2021, no app could ameliorate the collective gasp for breathable air. So in this fintech universe, we see new qualities of uncertainty and existential uncertainty exacerbated by the failed promise of digital citizenship and crony capitalist money-making schemes. And so this is why the pandemic is seen as something of an X-ray on this fintech India. But what can this tell us about the trust in context of an authoritarian regime courting its majoritarian public? On the one hand, we can think of the pandemic as an exceptional opportunity, and I have another paper on population culling. And there's a certain kind of population culling that goes on as in the famous axiom of making live and letting die. It is evident from Narendra Modi's stylized invocation of Hindu cultural myths, in particular the Lakshman Rekha that I won't develop here, but it's a kind of a magical boundary that you draw around you from the Hindu epic Ramayana, which is supposed to protect you from demonic hordes. And he invokes this in his first speech about the pandemic. Playing to a majoritarian upper caste Hindu polity, Modi exhorted the nation to shelter in place as if protected by this magical boundary. Such powerful symbols established the cleavages we were talking about. So if you have a home, you can have your Lakshman Rekha, while quilting together differences between Hindus. The point is to generate an affective investment in this mediatic strategy. Yet it would be disingenuous to say that after the medical supply crisis that affected everyone, those who buy into Modi's mythic repertoire and just are enacting credulous trust. Rather, there seemed to be a willed forgetting of these crises, even a denial that these were crises at all, and a canny investment in the one who works for the unified us. This is the kind of cynical trust. I would not say it's a skeptical trust, it's a cynical trust, a kind of a calculative rationality and a buy-in to Modi, who will take India to become a global power. So those aspects work together. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are increasingly political distrust that erupts occasionally, like we saw in the papers yesterday, around specific laws, the Citizenship Amendment Act and the anti-farm law mobilizations. To sum up, returning to the media question that has been central to our presentation, a last comment on the datafication of political life as one way to think about this capacity to forget. In Anti-Crisis in 2013, Janet Reutemann locates crisis as a second order of knowledge. That is, I may experience ill health and feel my symptoms before I abstract them as a threshold, a turning point in an underlying disease. My perception will spur thought about how this critical phase came to be, galvanizing almost always a critique of the past. And she's talking about the financial crisis. What had I missed? Where was I negligent? Crisis then is not intrinsic to the system, says Reutemann, but a distinction that produces meaning. This reconstruction is what has gone missing in some of the accounts of India's COVID experience. And I argue that the lacuna has everything to do with the obsessive reliance on data to characterize experiential uncertainties. So if anything, the Modi administration repeatedly has produced no data, both about the oxygen deaths and the migrant crisis. In fact, they protested a lot of the journalistic images to the Indian Supreme Court, saying that this was fake news and disinformation, so on and so forth. But by May 28, 2020, the administration maintained there were no migrants on the road. Yet the Supreme Court was still ordering them to make provisions. Civil society organizations, and this came in huge amount of social trust comes in here, was still reporting large numbers on the highways. As late as June 2020, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner exhorted the government to heed the Supreme Court order to make adequate provision, indicating a humanitarian crisis was still underway. These are institutional markers that provide a few points for plotting this crisis. But by mid-September 2020, the Ministry of Labor and Employment told the lower house that there was no data available about migrant deaths, despite their requirement to follow the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act of 1979. So this no data is the accompaniment to surplus data in digital India, while data remains now the empirical trace of large-scale disasters. Hence, it is perfectly possible to perform cynical trust by virtuous acts of forgetfulness, setting aside the singular story and scattered numbers as irrelevant at best and ill-intended at worst. Thank you.
So to conclude our panel this morning, we will have a contribution from Indra Spiecker, Döhmann, who is the chair in constitutional and administrative law and informational law, environmental law and legal theory here at Goethe Universität Frankfurt. She earned degrees among other places from Georgetown University, was a professor of information law at the Karlsruhe Institut für Technologie, KIT, before moving here and joining our university in 2013. And she is also a PI in ConTrust. Part of the reason why we're so happy to have her here at ConTrust is that her work, that she's actually one of the specialists in legal theory and in public law working on uncertainty. And that is what the focus of her latest book has been. And we're very much looking forward to your contribution. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. And I'll try to speed up because this is going to be a law presentation, so there will be lots of text up on the slides, just to prepare you for that. Let's start with what we've all been looking for, and this fits perfectly with my predecessors here, and that is Corona. Basically was a situation of large uncertainty. And why all of this uncertainty? We were asking, what is the virus doing actually? That was scientific, technological uncertainty. Which risks, which consequences does it show us? So it was health, social, economical. So that was social sciences uncertainty. What exactly are the infectious triggers? We could have found out probably, but there is a prohibitive cost of ascertaining this type of certainty. And do we finally force everyone to be tested, to be vaccinated, whatever? How can law deal with the situation? How can we regulate? That is a type of normative uncertainty. And that already spans that there are a number of reasons for uncertainty, a number of types. And I will, in the following, try to be a little bit more concise on the legal theory, if there is any, in law. That is exactly my starting point. Is there a legal theory of uncertainty? And I would claim there is none, really. The legal community, the court decisions, the administrative rules that we have, and I sometimes put up the German wording because as we lawyers work with wording, the exact wording sometimes matters. We see that we have certainty and that we look at certitude. We use indicative binary codes. It's something is legal or illegal. We don't have an in-between in the end. And we create an atmosphere that we have the art and we are in the research topic of decision making. And that creates us into being certain at the end. So my question in the following will be, how does administrative and constitutional law, and I'm not talking about private law here, deal with uncertainty that is faced by the state? And what thus governs state decisions under uncertainty? This was the introduction. I will follow with terminology and the general approach. Then I'll look at the types, and I've already named the reasons for uncertainty. I will look at the strategies to eliminate uncertainty, which is primarily the search for information, but there are some alternative strategies, and trust may be one of those. I will look at how legal decisions are then finally made, how they are being processed. I will look at control and monitoring of decisions and uncertainty. And probably by that time, you'll be in this status. And this is why then conclusion and outlook will follow. Let's look at the research area as such. Basically, we have lots of terminology. We see security, we see assurance, we see certitude, certainty, safety, knowledge. It's all in there. It's a big basket. It's all antipodal to risk, uncertainty, ignorance, disinformation, etc., etc. And we could list this much long. What really is what? And I can just follow up on what was said earlier. Actually, we don't know. Knight, everybody knows, yes, but I claim that Knight missed out on ignorance, which is the third category when we don't know what the real results are and not just don't have the ability to look at probabilities. So it's really discipline dependent concepts. And so I'm not going to go into that. What I would like to point out is that from a legal or also general point of view, there are no black swans, really. We see black swans when they're there, but actively ascertaining that there is not knowing something means that we have already surrounding knowledge, which allows us to describe what we don't know. So this is a talk on uncertainty, not on black swans or dotted swans or whatever. Legally exceptional is that not knowing. Practically, it's everyday business, but lawyers tend to look at the world as something they can create certainty about. Law typically assumes that there is complete knowledge, or at least that there's fully accessible information out there and that we can grasp it if we just try hard enough. What do we do typically? We transfer the solution to the courts, and that is we have burden of proof rules. And basically we just say, well, there's a personally responsible judge in the end with his personal conviction, plus there's protection of the judge against criminal proceedings, against wrongdoing. And all in the end, this creates a system in which the parties have certain rules by which they have to decide whether or not to go to court, face the uncertainty in court, and then follow along the burden of proof whether or not they can produce the proper information. This creates a verdict in the end, and that creates certainty. The world is this or that. Yes, you're asserting a particular right, or no, you're not. That's not what I'm looking at, because we're on slide number 9 and I can't finish yet. So the problem is not really solved because there is legislation at administration. Let's look at the knowledge orientation of those state decisions. And I would like to start out by saying it's a process. Knowledge changes during the entire decision process, and that process is actually around gathering of information a lot of times. Just 2 quick examples. German zoning law knows public participation, and we have in our administrative procedural code a provision which requires that the state actually produces and has a duty to gather information and to investigate. However, the decision as such just reflects one particular point in time, the exact law, the particular rule, an order against someone, and even a plan. Just look at the type of knowledge that is present at its time. In this process, we observe a lot of different instruments which law has established in order to deal with uncertainty, but we tend not to look at it through this perspective. This, what I'm describing in the following, is very closely related to which used to be a new approach, but not anymore really, which was the governance perspective. Schuppert, Hoffmann, Riem, Schmidt-Assmann, and finally one of our presidents of the Bundesverfassungsgericht actually, they all assembled this with a number of other scholars. The idea is that law is more, and that legal analysis is more than just looking at conflict management, at the establishment of rights, at equal opportunities, fairness, etc., etc. But rather, we're looking at what does the law really do? So we're looking at foresight, at prediction, at expectations. We're looking how addressees of norms really behave, and whether or not the law is not just declaring that this is the particular result, but is it really reaching that result? So we're looking at effects of law in reality. And that basically means it all depends on knowledge. Knowledge at the time of the decision, but also at the time of control, whether or not a law, a rule, an order really creates different behavior with the addressees. And that is the link to law and behavioral economics, sociology, political science, to a vast majority of interesting research questions, because all of a sudden we are looking at law as a tool rather than as the solution to it all. The uncertainty, and I'm not going to go deeper into this, in my understanding, is the situation prior to the decision. The risk is afterwards. So I'm deteriorating from, or I'm not deteriorating, but I'm using a different concept than the Nietzschean uncertainty here. There are different types of uncertainty and there are different reasons. And I'll just point out one of them, that's the objective versus subject. A lot of times there is knowledge out in the world, but the decision maker doesn't have it ready, doesn't even know where to get it maybe. That's something we have to deal with. And it's a structurally different situation than what we encountered in Corona, that nobody knew, and we would have to produce totally new information. Now, uncertainty can be described by a lack of knowledge. And that means, what is our premier tool? Well, get that knowledge, gather information, and thus, in the end, create uncertainty. Fairly easy. We have uncertainty eliminated wonderfully. Slide 15, problem solved. Would be nice, but I continue talking because information gathering itself is a decision under uncertainty. It's a second order problem if you so want. So the result of the search is questionable, and the search is typically dependent on the decision. Knowledge is procedure specific, and that means that there remains at least an objective uncertainty. That means a lot of things are missed out because you're not looking for the right things. Information is also a public good, which means information gathering and production is obstructed. That means even though we could maybe have information, we don't get it. There are no endless resources, including time. Corona didn't wait for us to find out. We needed to act. And finally, something which is underestimated, particularly among lawyers, I think, more information doesn't create necessarily better information, better knowledge, better decisions. There is uncertainty sometimes arising from the search for information. And we've seen that with Corona. Things are not certain. People, experts, non-experts, citizens disagree for several reasons. So what we need are stop rules, as I call them, that are necessary to begin. When do I start searching? When do I accept it from the beginning? And when do I end an information search? So when do I finally decide. And that is also a matter of uncertainty decision. There are numerous state instruments if you look closely how to gather information. There is the typical law and order, tell me what you know. There is general scientific research, the MPIfG or the DFG sponsoring us, for example. There are public petition processes, there are statistics, there are archives, there's the internet, there's interstate cooperation and organization, etc., etc. I won't go into that in detail. The decision when to end and which instruments to choose, interestingly, is discretionary, and it is not controlled, neither on the legislation nor on the administrative side. And that's something which we see in digitalization presently when we're talking about predictive policing, for example. It's the matter of the police deciding whether they use predictive policing tools or not. And the control of it is very, very limited. Same thing, state social media use. The state use of Microsoft, of Zoom, what we've all experienced, it's mostly not something that is governed by material and certainly not by procedural rules. Now, there are other ways. If gathering of information is not so fantastic, then one of the things is the law has one tool which is fantastic, and that is it can construct certainty. By simply defining the world as being this or that, by determining certain alternatives and options. For example, standardization or the creation of limit values. Something is dangerous if it is below, something is not dangerous if it is above a certain threshold. It doesn't matter whether that threshold is academically, scientifically sound or not. It creates, however, the legal, the normative standard as such. Fictions is another tool. Certain timeframes, if you get the information, if you have to decide in a particular time frame, if you have to choose this in a particular time, otherwise this or that will happen. The law very clearly creates a certainty of expectation here. Trust can really be an interesting concept of other ways to eliminate uncertainty, but public law is not thinking of trust. We're thinking of trust in the sense of, is there citizens' trust in government, et cetera, and we're thinking about it in democratic theory. But it's not something that in public law really has any kind of dogmatic substance. Maybe a little bit if you look at online elections, because one of the problems there is that there is not an efficient control. So maybe the trust of the citizens that elections can be controlled and thus the elections are legitimized is something which we might question. The other thing is that in certain areas, we declare that there is a certain stability and duration, a Vertrauensschutz, which has to be adhered to. But this is very limited, and I would like to point out this is different, definitely different in the civil service. Then integrity is something which we see sometimes as a means in law, part of being trust. There have been numerous things named yesterday and today also, and I would add one more thing, and that is transparency, which I think was a little bit underestimated and underevaluated yesterday. Not a great fan of transparency, but providing knowledge to the public is certainly something that creates trust because it claims that there's nothing to hide. And being a data protection specialist, I know that there's nothing to hide is not really a very good reason to share all information all of the times. And the India example was very telling on that. But still, what do we do then when we have a decision under uncertainty by legislation, by administration? The core question behind that is, how do you evaluate really the uncertainty? Is it a chance so that we go forward, or is it a risk so we say stop and don't do it? What covers that are uncertainty decision rules or decision modules, as the economic literature calls it. Normative rules, whether you take the positive or the negative interpretation. If we look at law, it's not there. We don't discuss that in public and administrative law. So what I did in my research was really looking at what do we have which might tell us how law advances with this. We have material substantive decision rules. For example, the balancing of interests, the fundamental human rights, et cetera, We have in individual laws that there are certain goals listed, why we have this regulation. We have standards of information gathering to a certain element. All that helps us at least get a glimpse of that there is something, whether we shall take uncertainty as a risk or a chance. What is interesting is if we take a detour into a different set of rules, and that is the economic decision rules. There we have, in the line of Frank Knight, but also of others who've also looked at ignorance, that there are certain ways how to cope with it. For example, expected utility, for example, that we reinterpret this if we don't have the probabilities, and also something like we take the best outcome in the worst situation, or we take the worst outcome in the best situation, or the worst and the worst, etc., etc. Well, we don't find that actively, but if we look at legal instruments, how decision-taking is there regulated, then all of a sudden it allows us to compare that to the economic standardization. And all of a sudden we can take some of the arguments from the economic literature and show that in the legal setting, we do have similar arguments. And that helps us to become, or to at least analyze the alternatives that we have. Let me take the precautionary principle as an example from environmental law. Precautionary principle strengthens the status quo, which is something, if you look at the economic analysis of the basically optimism, pessimism criteria or maximum, then you very quickly can identify that the precautionary principle is basically looking at somewhat the best outcome of the worst alternatives. And that basically helps us to ascertain that a precautionary principle might be useful in new technologies because we have large sets of uncertainty, but it's not a very good set if we're thinking about innovation, competition law, something like that. It also helps us to ascertain that there are different types, degrees, reasons, preconditions, consequences, state of the art, etc., of uncertainty decisions. And so I follow up to Jens Beckert that having some kind of a matrix might actually help to ascertain a little bit more what we can do, and thus, in the end, help control legal decisions. And it also helps us to identify that there are certain uncertainty-related regulatory instruments which the law so far has not really identified as such. In the end, what we have, once we have decided that we can use certain instruments which are in adherence with the decision module we have used, and that means that there are instruments which are in particular suitable, and there are others which are contradictory and don't fit there. And we see that when we look, for example, at the corona responses, that we see that there is a quick strengthening of certain instruments that we have not taken the road down otherwise. One of the things which lawyers tend not to think about is how our decision processes actually organized in law. For example, what we see is a lot of times that we have consecutive decisions, step by step, which is basically just splitting up the delegation in time, a decision in time. The second other thing is that we delegate. So basically we create, it's not the legislator deciding, but it is the administration, and the administration then decides it's one particular office which decides, and the office decides that they get one particular crew of experts, etc., etc. This is something which from political science we know is not creating trust, but it is a way of basically lowering the level institutional, how to decide under conditions of uncertainty, and how to distribute responsibility among those which are involved. That usually works with all types of decision rules. That's different if you look at regimes which concentrate on liability or self-regulation, because that leaves the amount of risk-taking completely to private parties. It doesn't give the state much of control because self-regulation always is only as good as what we call the shadow of the law, and usually there's not a very large and not a very dark shadow in this area. So here we have definitely a more positive approach and obviously a decision rule at heart, which says, oh, this is not going to be bad. Let's take risks here. Let's take uncertainty as a positive impulse. What we've recently seen a lot, and also fintech here, is sandboxing, experimental clauses, which is a big problem because can you experimentally just get rid of human rights? I'd say not really. It's certainly not suitable if you are following a more negativity-oriented rule, because like the precautionary principle wouldn't allow for saying, okay, let's just get rid of all these rules and regulations for a while and let's look where that takes us, because there might be risk associated with that type of behavior, which will not be compensated for in the end if they come true. Now, control and monitoring. If uncertainty is a process, I do have to monitor. a continuous readaptation of the regulatory impulse. Do we see that in law? No. We sometimes have sunset clauses, but we all know from the political science and also from observation that well, that doesn't really work. It's not like legislation was going to really check what they're doing, but the outcome is pretty clear of the white papers of the EU checking on the relevance of the GDPR, whatever. And we don't have any rules that tell us how that is exactly being done. We don't see a control of the assumptions underlying, for example, legislative action. And this was something that was a big problem in the Corona crisis, because legislation would assume something was happened this or that way, and then they would say, oh, it's not this way anymore, but they would not openly discuss it. If we look at uncertainty as a process, of course, the time of the control matters, and it matters what do you control? Do you control at the time of the decision or now? Is something legally valid if it is still valid, or do you just look at 2 years ago it was valid? And we don't really have clear rules for that. And I would just like to point out, because I'm interested in behavioral law and economics, be aware of the hindsight bias here. We all knew better at the end of the Corona pandemic, of course. If uncertainty is a process, then of course we also see that there must be a balancing of power between the different powers and the rule of laws. And they require there's clear responsibility who has to control what. And that means whatever I'm saying here on more control of uncertainty decisions does not mean that I want to restrict the political power of the legislator. But I believe that the legislator in conditions of uncertainty has to be very clear on the guidance if he uses delegation for the administration. And that means we have to share all of a sudden. And that is basically, we have to give reasons, which in the European context is something we're well aware of and that we deal with perfectly, but the German system just says, no, terrible, we don't want that. We need to give reasons so that the administration was, what were the assumptions under uncertainty under which this decision was taken by the legislation? Is it still true? And that helps us to ascertain whether or not there is still the rule of law, Article 20, Vorrang des Gesetzes, et cetera, to adhere to, or whether there's a situation where the law is simply not valid anymore substantively. I hope we're not here yet. And I promised I would do the conclusion and outlook. So is the problem finally solved on slide 24? I'd say no, because uncertainty in state decisions exists, but it's hidden. At least that was the case prior to Corona. And I'm wondering whether that will now change in the legal philosophy, really. Corona showed that citizens expect actively dealing with uncertainty. And I would be rather open and positive about this. I think they can deal with it much better than with this pseudo certainty, which was often declared by legislation and by administration. But there is no real legal concept yet, but we do have starters. There is the possibility of analysis with the aid of other disciplines. And I find it very interesting to hear media people analyze not just how it is being described, but also how the stacks basically show a certain development here. There needs to be a more differentiated processing of legislative and administrative certainty. And we need to look much more at the interior and the inside of decision taking by the administration and also by legislation. And trust can here potentially be a very valuable instrument. We have to look at very careful. Acceptance, for example, is something which I strongly contradict in law as being a legal thing. It's something that we can have at the end of it as a result, but not something that law itself can actually raise. And maybe trust is in a similar category like this. But let's look at it. And this is what ConTrust is really about. So the problem remains, and I think that's the best what I can say for research agenda, because ConTrust, I believe, will help solve it. Thanks.